Sorry, I'm a little slow to figure out whether this thing's running or not. I like having that sitting there so I know where we are. It may interfere with you guys. All right, so um, this is my video on environmental law. Uh, and um, so when we're looking at environmental law, um, we kind of have to back up a little, if you will, and look at the origins of uh, how do we treat the environment. In the common law, we used to look at the doctrine of sic utere tuo ut alienum non lidis. My Latin's atrocious. I always call this sic utere tuo. And that essentially, it's kind of an expression of the golden rule, if you will. So use your land as to not harm that of another. Um, Common law enforcement. So we would actually have to, you know, your cattle are destroying the land upstream, or uh, your mill dam creates it so that I can't run my mill dam. I got here first, that kind of stuff. Um, the basic standard was that you could not engage in anything that was an unreasonable interference with the use of someone else. Well, that is not as strong as we may want in an industrialized society. And we somewhat recognized, and as we'll see, we actually fly on the Clean Air Act predates what we're going to look at next, the Environmental Protection Act of 1970. Sorry, I'm not engaging camera. I'm looking at the screen here. It created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And that's been an up and down thing. There have been times when it's overreached and times when it didn't do enough. Um, it's interesting, though, that its enabling statute in particular uh, provided for citizen suits. And so from that, or because of that, or maybe I think these watchdog groups had a lot to do with the passage of this act. Clubs like the Sierra Club, environmental clubs, said, hey, wait a minute, Cuyahoga River fire is tip of the iceberg. Industry is destroying the planet. And I can assure you that, where the air was in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s compared to what it's like now, it is very night and day. Um, and we owe a lot to these groups that came in and sort of prodded the Congress, you've got to do something. Um, Also, you will find that a lot of EPA permitting involves local agencies. A lot of times the impact, and Alaska is a good touchstone, if you will, the impact of drilling up in the way northern reaches of Alaska, that's pretty, that's pristine wilderness up there. The Alaska pipeline, I think almost all Americans recognize, well, that's a great thing because uh, it gets us uh, oil and gas without having to necessarily import it. Oddly, the U.S. is now the world's largest producer of petroleum due to shale fracking and all that. We can go off into how many earthquakes this causes, but um, anyway, um, and another, but we can rely on, for instance, Native American groups, and they're going to get a big listen because of American history relative to Native Americans. Um, you know, they're going to be top priority listening posts for most of these agencies. And, most people who want to work for the EPA are pretty deeply concerned about the environment. And, you're going to have business leaders calling them activists, where, a lot of people are going, no, they're there to protect us. They're there to make sure we don't rape the land, that we don't destroy the land, that we don't destroy our water, that we don't destroy um, our precious natural resources. Um, anyway, there's something called the National Environmental Policy Act that created the Council on Environmental Quality. You may or may not, your industry may or may not be covered by this. There's kind of a categorical exclusion, that is, it's listed in the statute. What I read of this is it is primarily um, industries that are already heavily regulated, like healthcare, that don't need a new set of regulations. That agency that regulates them can already kind of take care of the environment, or they better understand the give and take of medical waste. Whereas the Environmental Protection Agency may come up with these really onerous bans on its own, and it may uh, permit interplay between the governing agency, but you don't necessarily want every business to have to comply with 15 different agencies, as we talked about in the administrative law one. You can get into this regulatory shakedown where hey, you're not complying with us. Well, I'll bring these other people in, and and we'll find out who's going to win. And the agencies, the deck is stacked against those of us who have to comply, because um, you know if the agency's actions are not deemed arbitrary and capricious, agency action stands. So anyway, to see whether or not you're covered by this, look in the categorical exclusion. Um, you know, they're going to do an initial environmental assessment of any project that's proposed. Um, if on balance the EPA finds that its environmental impact is not significant, uh, then they may permit it. And by permit it, they'll issue the permit for the project to go forth. Um, and so, you may or may not want to read this more carefully. If they find significant environmental impact, then you've got to play this environmental impact statement game. And using the pipeline as the standard example, it's going to have significant environmental impact, and you're going to play in this. And you can expect a minimum of 5 years in the permitting process, getting the permit. And more like 10. It can be 8 to 10. And, you play with these 5 factors. They're listed in the book. You can find them elsewhere. I've got my book open, but it's pretty small print. Then we're going to invite public comment. As we talked about with the EPA, we want the locals, to be able to come in. And there's, the pipeline coming out of the Bakken shale deposits has had to weather a number of local environmental storms. Uh, Other businesses, and there are businesses that are going to walk in and go, hey, we need this pipeline because um, this is better for us. They're going to invite it on both sides. Not everybody is opposed to every every development project. Um, there's give and take here. Um, so ultimately, some of the biggest, most powerful stuff, uh, the Clean Air Act passed 1963. It's very complex. It's multiple amendments. There's a stationary source regulation, and there's kind of a market-based approach. You have so many credits, so many cubic meters of air you can foul, depend on what your business is. Very heavily regulated. As you come up or down in a business, you then get this saleable commodity. You can sell this, your right to pollute, to heavier polluters, um, and they can take bits and pieces of. So anyway, I'm not going to pretend to understand how this works. I can tell you that our air is cleaner. Um, has it worked perfectly? I don't know. They also talk in the text about um, there's some potential trade-off that might be available to you. If you can improve your operations in one part of your factory system, let's just say that Cleveland is where the majority of your difficulties are created. If you can do it, alleviate that to a certain extent, and the fact that your Nebraska facilities and your Utah facilities don't pollute that much, and they actually uh, you may get some trade-off that will permit this amount of Cleveland pollution because we're getting this benefit elsewhere. Um, Big thing that impacts most of us individually is mobile sources, tailpipe emissions. Now, the biggest polluters are over-the-road trucks. Um, to a, you would think this odd, but to a much lesser extent, railroads. Railroads are actually fairly efficient. They emit a lot of fumes when they first get going, but once they get going, the laws of physics kind of keep them going. It's an almost frictionless environment. They're steel on steel, and once they get those millions of tons moving, um, it's kind of hard to stop them. It takes like 2 miles to stop a freight train doing 40 miles an hour, and that's on straight track. Anyway, so there is something here in the law. California was permitted more stringent um, regulations. And most of this is due to the fact that there's a huge mountain range that runs down the middle of California, and the prevailing winds don't lift all of this horrible smog from Los Angeles out and over to Bakersfield. It tends to just stay there. And so California has been given the ability to write its own standards, and those standards have impacted a lot of automobiles because a great many automobiles come in at the port, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, in the LA area. Um, and so those cars, in order to be imported into California, have to pass California emission standards. Um, Maybe in part why a lot of the foreign country companies have moved into the South, because they don't have this kind of stuff as they're going. We've seen also the addition of fuel economy standards. This has been a political football for a long time. Um, if you can believe the Wall Street Journal, it's sort of forced uh, uh, the major manufacturers to build these kind of junky cars that nobody wants to buy, and they build them below cost, and that gives them their average fuel efficiency across the fleet. Uh, and so it's been dodged, if you will. Interesting thing that you've got useful life of systems, and here they're talking about the systems that move the tailpipe emission out. When I was a kid in the 70s, we went to a catalytic converter. I don't think they use those anymore. They weren't very good. They weren't very reliable. They didn't last very long. Um, and you now have to have uh, problem detection units in place. I think it was Volkswagen that got caught recently. They found a way to bypass these regulations by only counting emissions every 6 seconds or something like that, and then timing the burn appropriately. We also, under the Clean Air Act, have the right to regulate fuel composition. Um, so let's move over to the Clean Water Act. Here again, we're dealing with permitting. Can we build that factory? This is individual. That means that facility. We also create under this act general geographic areas so that we might have, you know, the county of St. Louis could petition to build a certain development zone, and we can sort of contain the amount environmental impact there. And you can look at shipping warehouse areas or areas, if we look at the old steel mills, like in Granite City. I grew up in Edwardsville, so, Granite City, or we look at all the petroleum refineries over in Wood River. They were concentrated in kind of localized spaces so that they didn't they only affected those areas, if you will. It was only nasty there. And, that's easier for the regulators to deal with. Um, you know, both of these systems require best practical control technology. Um, you know, the standard tends to be best available regardless of cost. Um, there's always some pushback here. We're not necessarily going to force businesses to go out of business in order to get to these better spaces. This is a real touchy area. We also don't want to permit free polluting. Um, this is my pick on China deal. China creates the majority of its electricity with coal-fired power plants. The environmental impact on these is incredible. In the U.S., because of fracking, we've gone much more to natural gas-based electrical systems. Get on my high horse here. A lot of people crow about, well, my electrical car doesn't pollute. Well, they're not really looking at how does your electricity get created. We burn stuff in order to create electricity. In Canada, they call it hydro because they have enough power in their rivers to uh, drive their turbines over dams and that sort of thing. But they sell a lot of their electricity to us. That's a big deal for them. Um, there are timelines for implementation. You may be given time in the space of getting these things, but they're going to be pretty careful and pretty rigorous, and the extensions you may have to battle uh, fairly vigorously to get a 1 or 2 year extension. Ultimately, we want cleaner air. We want to maintain clean water spaces. Um, and, overall, these have really been good things. They've, of course, have driven the cost up, and we can talk about, that's been able to be shared across a broad economy. And that's why a lot of times we're going to see this best available feature. It's certainly one we can run on as a politician. And, I'm protecting the land. Um, there's also a session in here about oil spills, and they in particular focused on the Deepwater Horizon spill, which, when you look at the facts, I think that was an Exxon platform. They were guilty. They knew they had real problems with that particular platform. Um, Out in the Gulf of Mexico, I don't recall its depth. I think it may have been at 400 feet. Um, and it's pretty expensive to send a submersible down and fix it. And they didn't really have good relief valve systems or alternative pumping systems. Um, and eventually it blew, and it was nasty. It created a really big oil spill and killed a lot of wildlife, not a high point in the petroleum industry. Um, it led directly to a moratorium on drilling. Again, political football. The party not in power at the time campaigned on drill, baby, drill. Um, once this was alleviated, but there were civil fines levied. I can't remember what it was. It's 20 billion. It was a lot of money. And then there were some criminal charges levied as well against executives. This went pretty far up. It was really bad. My recollection is this was pretty active neglect, and they deserved to be punished. That's probably being too tough on them, but this is we're going to entrust you with, as a business, with the health and safety of our environment. Expect to be heavily regulated. Um, so there's also solid waste regulations in environmental law. My wife refers to the giant mound that's over next to Cahokia Mounds as Mount Trashmore. That thing has grown incredibly in my lifetime. It's almost obscuring the arch as we come back from visiting my mother up at Glen Carbon. Um, it's getting big and getting bigger, and I don't know what we're going to do with all this solid waste. We've got a student visiting us who's from China, a friend of my daughter's, and she can't get back home because of the coronavirus issue. But we were talking about how do they deal with the waste in China. I think they burn most everything, but I don't really know that. Anyway, um, there's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which looks like active and future. What are you doing right now? What are you trying to do to preserve things? Let's get into some of our resource conservation. This is active, and what's your plan in the future? It's got kind of a cradle to grave. You created it. How's it going to get disposed of? Plastics are a hot button issue. Plastics don't degenerate very quickly. We've got these floating islands out in the middle of the Pacific. Somehow they just keep attracting more and more and more and more. Again, you're going to have to report the processes that you're doing. If you watch the administrative law, this is the sort of record keeping that we need to talk about. There's a potential that you've got civil liabilities. An enforcement group might bring this in and seek damages. There's always potential of criminal liability. Now, remember, with criminal, you've got to have the mens rea to break the law. But when it comes to the environment, these laws are written pretty tightly. And these all apply to the generator of the waste, the transporter of the waste, and the receiving facility for the waste. Um, I don't know who called me. Anyway, I received it on my watch. What an amazing thing. Uh, so another action that we're going to look at is the Toxic Substances Control Act, which essentially looks at all chemicals except pesticides, tobacco, nuclear, and Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This is a good example of regulations that deal exclusively with, we're not going to regulate already heavily regulated industries. These things are not going to, pardon me, they say they block it and, and they don't. So sorry about this. Um, it looked like to me as I read this, and these are not acts I'm really deeply familiar with. Um, uh, you've got a reporting and tracking, um, but I didn't see any mention of liabilities, like civil liabilities or potentially criminal liabilities. Um, I went into the EPA to try to search what was going on here, and I found that the EPA website didn't work very well, oddly. That may be part of the conspiracy theory that the current sitting president wants to limit regulatory authority. I love how they block that, but don't block it. um, so they've got some kind of workaround on this bloody thing of mine. All right, the big deal that we need to talk about here is CERCLA. And this is the kind of super fund. Um, there was a dioxin uh, not spill. There was a guy, and I can't remember his name, but he took, I think it was Times Beach. So if you're my student's age, my kid's age, 22, you probably don't remember anything about this. But in the 80s, it was a big deal locally. This was one of the worst toxic dump sites in the US, and it was close to the Merrimack River, and the compounds were leaching out. I think what they did was actually just dump on top of uh, an ammunition disposal site, or it was close by an ammunition disposal site created by our military of old, sarin gas and all kinds of nasty stuff that we had built for the Korean and the Vietnam War. And then as we didn't use it, we stored it somewhere. And of course, we didn't store it very well. And that leads us back to this cradle to grave Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. How do you contain this stuff so that if it leaks really slowly and it has minimal impact? Times Beach was pretty bad. So one of the things that Congress created was a super fund where they created an almost endowment source. Here's $250 billion, and what we want you to do is spend 3% of it on an annual basis and sort of invest the rest, if you will, so that over time we'll have enough money that this will last the 100 years or more it's going to take us to clean all these up. If you go look on the internet at Superfund, my recollection was there were well over 2,100 still active sites. No, here it is, National Priorities List. There were 25,000 sites. And I didn't look it up yet. It's in the textbook. And it looks at variety and variation. And of course, the St. Louis area has a ton of them. We had steel industries. We've had a lot of heavy polluters. Even Anheuser-Busch was at one point in time a pretty heavy polluter. They've toned that down. A lot of the smoke capture facilities have really helped it. But, um, you know, this was initially funded by tax primarily on the chemical and petroleum industries, as we've talked about earlier. Those, the Cleveland Cuyahoga River fires were mostly chemical manufacturers. And then we talked about the Deepwater Horizon big spills. We've had a lot of problems with petroleum over the years. So, kind of a cost of doing business is you pay into this super fund. And then we've also caused others to have to pay into it. The EPA has power to bring suits against the landowner or the responsible party. And so this has caused some, it's pretty hard to, quote, move an old gas station. If you buy an old gas station, you've got a Superfund site sitting there, because almost every petroleum station had an oil tank to it. Almost all of those leak. The gasoline tanks all leaked. You've got to remediate all this ground. So that means you've got to lift all the ground up and then mix it in with enough other good ground to be able to send it off to somewhere and scatter it throughout the land, if you will, so that its impact is minimal. And you may have to go 50 times as much dirt as you pulled out. You've got to go buy clean dirt at that level to remediate this. And and then if you're going to build a new, and this is before you can build a new gas station there, so there is some shield against secured lenders and innocent buyers of this land, but I've put this all boldface innocent, or not boldface, all caps, because it's pretty hard to be a completely innocent buyer. You really should dig into the prior uses of this land. Um, at the same time, they've begun to modify this slightly to get prospective purchasers. We'd rather get this land back in use. We'd rather it return to productivity. We may work with them to give them incentives to buy and remediate, reduce the future waste, limit future contamination. Can you contain it on site, and find a way to limit its leakage out into water sources and other stuff? But overall, we've made a lot of progress. We have a lot less toxic sites. This works relatively well, and I can tell you our air and our water is much cleaner than when I was a kid. And that terminates my recording. Thank you for listening.